and their swords. So those were the terms of surrender. The defeated Confederates would be required to sign pledges promising not to fight against the Union any longer. The Confederate soldiers were required to surrender their weapons, and General Grant allowed the Confederate officers to keep their pistols and horses. Now, this really wasn't in the terms of surrender, but Grant allowed all Confederates who had either a horse or a mule to keep them. He was quoted as saying, "Let all the men who claim to own a horse or mule take the animals home with them to work their little farm." So he did allow all Confederates that had a mule or a horse to keep those. And he wanted them to take those home and try to get their farms back into action. So all Confederates who had a horse or mule were allowed to keep them, as Grant was quoted as saying, "Let all the men who claim to own a horse or mule take the animals home with them to work their little farm." You have to really write that quote down, but that's what he said. Well, after the terms were written down and announced, a proud General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant. When the terms were written down, announced, and agreed upon, a very proud General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant. When the meeting ended, General Lee mounted his horse, Traveler, and simply rode off. After the surrender meeting had ended, General Lee mounted his horse, Traveler, and rode off. Now this was kind of interesting because Grant did two things to show some compassion to General Lee as he rode off. Obviously, what do you think happened after, Lee left and everybody on the Union side, the troops that were surrounding the area, what did they start to do once Lee rode off? Well, kind of, not so much that, but they began to, cheer. They began to celebrate. And Grant ordered them to be silent in respect to General Lee. So when General Lee got out there, mounted his horse, started to ride off, Union soldiers began to celebrate. I can imagine why they would, but Grant made them be silent as Lee rode off. Now, the word hadn't got out yet about this surrender, so what are you hearing in the background? Cannon fire, because there's a battle going on. And this nearby cannon fire, you could hear quite clearly as Lee mounted his horse and rode off. And Grant then said this. He said, quote, "Tell them to stop that racket. The Southerners have surrendered. I see no reason to embarrass them further." So as cannon fire was still going in the distance after the surrender, because the word hadn't got out yet, Grant promptly states, "Tell them to stop that racket. The Southerners have surrendered. I see no reason to embarrass them further." Now, before we talk about final effects and casualties of the war, and then go on to the post-war South, you have to understand that this isn't cell phone time. It took a lot of these Confederate and Union units a period of days to find out what? The war is over. So there were soldiers killed on both sides after the surrender at Appomattox. Okay? And then on the other hand, if you've ever watched the movie The Outlaw Josie Wales, anybody seen that movie? How many have seen The Outlaw Josie Wales? If you haven't, it's a sad thing that you haven't. But a lot of these Southerners weren't going to accept surrender. And you had a lot of holdouts, a lot of people that held out and still wanted to continue to fight that war. And in the movie Outlaw Josie Wales with Clint Eastwood, that's basically where he is on that. And he's got a group of rabble-rousers that have not surrendered yet, and they're raising Cain, and they're trying to get these soldiers in to surrender. So it takes the Union a period of time to get all these kind of rebel-rousers, those guys that are still fighting after the surrender, to kind of come in and turn in their weapons and sign their pledges and keep their horses. And so That's kind of what the basis of the Outlaw Josie Wales is about. And I'm going to show you an excerpt out of that. It kind of explains kind of what I'm talking about. So this thing didn't end like as soon as he signed the paper, because the word had to get out. And then there were still some Southerners who said, nah, I'm not ready to quit yet, that continued to fight this war several weeks later. Okay? All right, well, let's move on to final effects and casualties of the Civil War. Now, you don't really have to write this down. I'm going to give you some statistics, but I want to make sure you hear it. Obviously, the Civil War in America had really affected families on both sides. And I think Wesley Culp, for example, is an example who, a Confederate who died on his uncle's land in the North. Families from both the North and the South reunited after the Civil War to grieve the loss of their loved ones. And I'm not sure, historians have noted that nearly every family felt some tragic event of losing a loved one during the Civil War. When you think about when I give you these statistics on how many were, killed, wounded, and captured, I mean, every family was affected by it. Some families lost both sons, or all three sons. You know what I mean? It was really kind of devastating. So we also have to remember that people who died in the Civil War, not only soldiers fighting for their cause, but there were a lot of innocent bystanders who ended up getting killed as well. Civilians, it happens. And where were most of those civilians killed? Well, not a specific battle, but where? In the South, because they're defending their homeland. So a lot of Southerners that weren't even soldiers, men, women, children, lost their lives as a virtue of the Civil War as a civilian. So we'll give you some casualties here, and I want you to write these down if you would. Okay? Let's talk about Union losses, and we're going to give you three categories. Either killed in action, which means dead on arrival, so to speak, killed in battle, dead on the battlefield, or death resulted from, in other words, they were wounded and died, or they were simply wounded, okay? Because prisoners of war were exchanged pretty quickly after this thing was over because we were one nation. So we're talking about the casualties here, and we're going to talk about the Union first, and again we're going to be talking about those that were killed in action, killed in battle, those that were wounded, death resulted, wounded and died as a result, and those that were wounded. So here's just the Union side. Killed in action, 110,070. Union side, killed in action, 110,070. Let's compare that to the Confederates killed in action, okay? So whereas the Union, I kind of set you up badly there, but as far as the Union goes, the number killed in action was 110,070. Confederate killed in action, 74,524. 74,524. Now let's talk about Union losses concerning death resulted. In other words, they were wounded and died as a result of that. So death resulted. The Union lost 249,458. 249,458. That would be those that resulted death from their wounds. 249,458. How about the Confederates? Some of these Confederate numbers are estimates, so this would be kind of an estimate. 124,000 deaths resulted on the Confederate side. About twice as many for the Union, right? How many were wounded on the Union side, wounded and survived? 275,175. 275,175. Compared to the Confederate wounded of about 137,000. Again, what the Union had, all twice as many. So here's what is crazy. Here are the total losses, either killed in action, death resulted, or wounded. The Union, 634,703. 634,703. 634,703. How many Confederate losses total? Killed in action, death resulted, or wounded? 335,524. 335,524. But think about this. Here is the total casualties. Killed, death resulted, or wounded on both sides. 970,227. 970,227. How many people live in the state of Wyoming? About 500,000. This is almost twice as many people that live in Wyoming that were either killed in action, death resulted, or wounded. Now this is kind of interesting. If we just take the killed in action, which was 184,594, you don't have to write that down, that was 10% of the total population of this country was killed in action. Can you imagine that? I mean, we're looking at 50% probably of the population of this country either killed in action, death resulted, or wounded. 50% of the country. I mean, that was some serious losses. Generations were wiped out over this deal, right? Okay, that'll take us into our very last subtopic, which is the post-war South. Is it on your sheet? No, I added that, but you don't have any ID. So the post-war South. I'm just going to kind of talk about the immediate effects of the Civil War and the post-war, because what are we going into next? We'd like to go into Reconstruction and see what Lincoln's going to do about reuniting the Union, but what's going to happen? We're going to go into his assassination, and then after that, then we'll talk about how Andrew Johnson is going to try to reconstruct the country. Okay? Now, here's the thing to remember about the post-war South. When the firing of the Civil War ended, the South had completely collapsed, both economically and socially. Total collapse of the South, economically and socially. Once beautiful cities like Charleston, South Carolina, Richmond, Virginia, Atlanta, Georgia, Savannah, Georgia, beautiful cities, gutted and in ruins. Gutted and in ruins. So such beautiful cities as Charleston, South Carolina, and Richmond, Virginia, and Atlanta, Georgia, and Savannah, Georgia. Once really rich cities, Vicksburg, Mississippi. You could go on and on. These beautiful cities that thrived in the South prior to the Civil War were simply gutted and in ruins. This is kind of an interesting quote, just listen to it. One man from Atlanta who returned to the city that he once lived in was quoted as saying, in describing what Atlanta looked like, he said, quote, "Hell has laid her egg, and right here it hatched." That's what he thought about the appearance of Atlanta. He said, "Hell has laid her egg, and right here it hatched." Let's talk about the negative mark that the Civil War left on the Southern way of life. Concerning their way of life, Native American way of life, buffalo, religion, freedom. That's what it took for them to live. What did it take the Southerners to live? Social institutions, economic life, and agriculture. That was their way of life. Social institutions, economic life, and agriculture. Let's talk about social institutions. What are social institutions that basically are no longer in existence in the South after the Civil War? What are some social institutions? Usually go there on Sundays. Churches. There wasn't a church standing. So the social institution of the church is in ruins. So concerning social institution, churches were battered and left in ruins. What else? What social institution are you studying in right now? Schools. Absolutely battered and left in ruins. So how's the educational system in the South after the Civil War? In chaos. There isn't a school standing. Teachers were killed. Those that fought in battle, those that maybe were victims, citizens. Your educational system was in complete chaos after the Civil War. Schools destroyed, teachers killed in battle. How about economic life? Is there a bank or business working in the South after the Civil War? No, because they're all ruined, either financially or physically. So as far as economic life, banks and businesses had to lock their doors, most ruined either by damage or inflation. There's no businesses going on in the South. Your factories that were in the South, once doing well, smokeless, silent, torn apart. How about the transportation system? How's that railroad system in the South doing? There isn't one, so it's all tore up. They got nothing going for themselves economically. Nothing. Businesses closed or ruined. Banks closed or ruined. Transportation system, absolutely torn apart. You can't get anywhere because it's all been destroyed. And what's their main source of income? Agriculture. How's that looking for them? All their farms are destroyed. Any seeds that they had have been destroyed. Livestock, all was driven away or killed by Union soldiers. And the most important thing, all the slave labor is gone. So agriculturally, they got nothing. They got no farms. They got no seed to even start over. They have no livestock because it was either taken, driven off, or killed by Union soldiers as Sherman marched to the sea. And they have no slave labor. They have nothing. Now, whose responsibility is it going to be to try to fix this incredibly large mess in the South? President Lincoln. Unfortunately for this country, he doesn't get a chance because he's going to be killed in April of 1865, shortly after the surrender at Appomattox. And a Democratic congressman from Tennessee, no offense, Andrew Johnson's going to all of a sudden assume this tremendous responsibility to rebuild the South. And I just give you a little hint, he ain't going to get her done. Not going to happen. Okay? So, there we go. That's the end of things. So what we'll do tomorrow is I'm going to show you a video on the Gettysburg Address. And I'm also going to show you that little short from Outlaw Josie Wales. And then Monday, more than likely, we'll probably have a review. And Tuesday, we'll figure out something, or maybe make sure you know what you need on the test. And the test will be Wednesday without doubt. Okay? That's where you're at. So, nope. So you guys that are wrestling and speech and debating and all that, you